Welcome to Building the Future, hosted by Kevin Horick. With millions of listeners a month, Building the Future has quickly become one of the fastest rising programs, with a focus on interviewing startups, entrepreneurs, investors, CEOs, and more. The radio and TV show airs in 15 markets across the globe, including Silicon Valley. For full showtimes, past episodes, or to sponsor the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com.
Welcome back to the show. Today we have Karen Walker. She's been in your shoes. As employee 104 at Compaq Computer, she led the organization from zero to a $15 billion in annual revenue. For the past 20 years, she's been a consultant, executive coach, and thought partner for high-level executives facing growth at Lightspeed. Karen, welcome to the show.
So happy to be here, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. You've actually done an astronomical amount of things, and you're continuing on that path. But maybe before we get into all that stuff, let's get to know you a little bit better and start off with where you grew up.
Oh, sure. Well, I'm a product of the West Texas oil fields.
Okay.
I grew up in Odessa, Texas, which is sort of midway between Dallas and El Paso, and literally in the middle of the desert. My high school was the Friday Night Lights High School.
Oh, very cool.
So yeah, and so what we had in Odessa was really oil, football, and sand. So that's what I grew up with. And then I went to school and became an engineer by degree.
Okay. What made you want to take engineering, out of curiosity?
Yeah, so my dad was an engineer.
Okay.
And I was really good at science and math, and I kind of never gave that a second thought. The other things I was good at, like English, at least back in the day, if you were good at something, you could place out of it. And so sadly, as much as I love reading, I no longer, at that point, I just placed out of English. And so I didn't follow any of those things that I love doing as well, at least not academically. But I did follow science and math, and I got my degree in engineering, although I wasn't an engineer very long. It has certainly stood me in good stead in terms of teaching me how to think about problems.
Interesting. No, that's cool. So you get out of school. Walk me through your career at Compaq up until leaving and doing your own thing.
Oh, sure. So I went to work for a company called Texas Instruments, which was a Fortune 100 company, I'm going to say, at that time.
Sure.
Right out of school. I'd interned with them, and so I went right back. And after a couple of years, and I had a pretty stable job. I was getting promotions every 6 months, and I was doing, I was managing a couple of people, and which was pretty, good for somebody in their early 20s at that point.
Sure.
But I noticed some people leaving that I really thought a lot of. And in particular, some director level managers that were leaving, and they were starting a new company down the street, according to the grapevine. And I really admired these people, and I thought, well, why are they leaving, and what are they going to do? And this was back in the early '80s, and there weren't startups on every corner then, like there are now. It was an unusual thing. So anyway, I went down and interviewed with them, and they hadn't shipped any product yet, and I didn't know what they were building. We assumed one thing because of the division that they came out of, but it turned out to be something else. And I said, look, I don't know if I can do this job or not, because I think you guys are going to require clean rooms and doing things with creating semiconductors. And they said, oh no, you can do this job. Please come. And so I took a big leap of faith. I left that job, much to my mother's dismay, and I went to work at this little startup, and which turned out to be Compaq Computer.
Okay, interesting.
Which was then the fastest growing company in American history. So we did $111 million in our first year.
Wow.
We were the fastest to $1 billion. And by the time I left 14 years later, we were at 15 billion and had grown from 104 people to about 17,000. And for me, I went from a sort of a party of one, being in charge of the physical infrastructure, to growing my part of the organization. I think I had about 350 direct people in my organization, and then thousands of contractors and consultants worldwide. And what we were doing was creating the physical infrastructure, which is to say we had to decide what we needed where and when in terms of physical facilities. So all the real estate stuff,
Sure.
which is the longest lead time item for a computer company. And we were
Interesting.
growing so fast, we didn't know how much we needed. And we were always afraid, right, that we were going to have a downturn. And you didn't want to have this expensive real estate either owned or leased if you had a downturn. So I got really good at creating flexible solutions to the problems of fast-growing companies, and also at creating high-performance teams that were aligned and could get to work quickly. So really accelerating that performance. And so that's what I did for 14 years.
Very cool. No, it's cool because I remember my dad used to bring home on the weekend. He worked for the government up here, the little like Apple IIe. But the first computer we had at home, I remember it was I can't remember the exact model, but it was like the Compaq like 386, and that thing was just like lightning fast at the time, right?
I know, it's so sad to look back, but it's what we had.
It's like Windows 3.1.
Yeah, I remember getting off a plane in Singapore and seeing someone lug one around, and I was like, wow, we're a real company now, right? But it was giant, and it did so little. But interestingly enough, I mean, one of the things about Compaq was that we fought with IBM over an open standard on the software front. And there's an interesting documentary out by an Academy Award nominated director called Silicon Cowboys.
Oh, yeah.
It's on Netflix and iTunes now. We premiered at South by Southwest a couple years ago, which was so much fun.
Very cool.
But anyway, if people are more interested sort of in the history of that time, I think it's a really good documentary.
No, very cool. So walk me through your journey to leaving Compaq to doing your own thing. Like, what made you decide to move on from there? Like, sure, you were there for a long time, but what made you actually decide to leave and do your own thing?
Yeah, so it was a really interesting time for me because, I mean, being there at sort of the big bang and then, growing with the company over all those years. And, it was a whole different skill set to be working there when there were, again, 17,000 people rather than 104 of us trying to get everything done between us.
Sure.
And of course, what happens at most big companies, I'm sure there's someone somewhere in the universe that's found a way around this, but at most companies that size, it's just different, right?
Fair.
Your culture is different. The people you attract are different. It's not that you can't still get good things done. It's just a different kind of environment. And often the culture is very different as well. And I realized that my job at that point was just going to get bigger, but not any different, because at that scale, you can't really move a VP laterally. At least it's pretty rare for that to happen. And so I had some other things I wanted to pursue, but I didn't know what yet. So, and this is not advice for other people to follow. It's just what I did. I got okay with leaving the money, which was seriously a consideration because at that point in time, you have lots of options, right?
Sure.
But I was confident that I could always put food on the table if it came to that. And I left and I moved to New York City. We were in Houston, moved to New York City, took classes at Columbia, and some different, architecture and philosophy and whatnot. Went to every conference I ever thought I wanted to go to, met a lot of authors, and just did a lot of sort of, what do I want? As opposed to what am I good at doing? Because I think most people that are successful, we're good at a lot of things that aren't necessarily what we love. They're just things we're good at, and so people keep giving them to us to do.
Well, okay. I want your thoughts on this. Sorry to interrupt you, but you actually got me thinking about this lately. It's like, I've been a designer my entire career for the most part, right? And a few years ago, well, maybe like a decade or so ago, I got kind of bored of doing it, right? Mm-hmm. And I wanted to do something different. But again, to your point, like people, well, you're good at it, we're just going to give you that. And you're like, well, no, I want to do this other thing. But it's kind of like, this is what you do, so we need you to keep doing that. And it's hard because you need to, I feel like, at least for myself, like I stepped away from it for a few years and then kind of came back to it, and the passion came back, but it took me some time away. Did you find that as well, or what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a common dilemma that we find ourselves in. So for me, I couldn't figure out while I was at Compaq what I wanted to do
Sure.
next. I was just too busy.
Okay.
And so I would tell people I'm leaving, but I don't know what I'm going to do next. And they're like, oh, how can you do that?
Sure. Which
And I'm
is
like, well,
scary, though, to be
it
fair, for
is.
most people.
For most people, absolutely. But it's just me.
Sure.
And again, I had confidence that, one of my options was I could be a Zen monk, which wasn't going to take a lot of money to live on. So
Sure.
I'd have been fine if that had been the path I had taken. So I wasn't worried about finding something to do. It was more about how do I figure out what's next.
Okay.
But for most people who didn't have the fortunate circumstance that I found myself in, I think sort of the easier path would be to continue to do what you're good at that people will pay you for, but maybe to do less of it so that you can free up some time to explore the other things that you're interested in doing. And to also figure out, so what are the things that you love about your current job that you're really good at? So maybe it's not the design that you're doing, maybe it's the problem solving.
Sure.
And how do you take those strengths that you're really good at, that maybe you love doing, and apply them to other problems, right? So sort of go back to the base of what it is that you like doing, not just where you're applying it.
Yeah, no, that's actually really good advice, because I'm sure others listening have struggled with that, right? Because it's so tricky. Well, and probably the people that you work with, right? If you've been the
Right.
CEO or you're a high level person at a company that's successful, walking away from
Mm-hmm.
6+ figures or more a year to go chase a passion is not
Yeah.
always in the cards, right?
Right. I think the other thing people struggle with is, so I have to figure out, if I'm not going to do this, how am I going to fulfill my life's dream next month?
Sure.
Um, and that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
So the other thing to think about is just, so you don't have to figure out what you're going to be doing in 30 years. Just figure out what you're going to be doing next.
Sure.
That is directionally correct for you.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Fair enough.
And so it's not as most careers, and particularly most careers in modern times, are not straight lines.
Sure.
Right. My mother knew from the time she was 2 years old she wanted to be a nurse, and
Okay.
she was her whole life.
Very cool.
That's the work she did. Good for her. I'm proud of her. But most of us, I wanted to be a nuclear scientist or an archaeologist when
Okay.
I was a little. Right. Those were my goals. Well, by the time that's not what I did.
Sure.
I ended up doing something completely different, and then completely different again. But always sort of building on these core strengths that I have as I understood myself better.
Sure. So walk me through your career post Compaq, because you've been doing your own thing for a long time. You wrote a book. And those are just kind of a couple of things, but walk us through that journey and
Sure.
up until
Yeah.
leaving Compaq, what you're doing now, and kind of that whole journey, because I think that's fascinating.
So when I left Compaq, as I said, I left Houston, moved to New York.
Yeah.
I just explored. I called it my walk around. And I had a consulting job fall in my lap in San Francisco. So I moved to Sausalito.
Nice.
And I lived on a houseboat so I could drive over the Golden Gate Bridge to work every day.
Sweet.
Which was awesome. And I met my now husband,
Okay.
who I'm an engineer by degree. He's a psychologist.
Okay.
And he had been working with tech CEOs on creating high performance teams.
Okay.
And
Interesting.
really helping them execute. And so we learned a lot from each other. And as I said, I went back to Columbia. I got theory behind the practice that I knew.
Sure.
And we worked together for 10 years. And then he decided one day that he really would rather be teaching Tai Chi and fishing.
Okay.
And so that's what he's doing now. And I'm like still full steam ahead.
Interesting.
But the work has really been around primarily tech, not 100%, but I'd say probably at this point 90% of my clients are in the tech space.
Sure.
Once an organization finds its product market fit, there's the then what, right?
Sure.
How do we take advantage of this opportunity that's in front of us? And so working with CEOs, high-level leaders in organizations to make sure that they're clear about what they're doing and why. Strategy, which is not a book that goes on the shelf,
Sure.
but what's the practical strategy that you're driving towards? What are your measurements for how you'll get there? How do you stay aligned around that with all the, all the myriad of things that are present that you could be doing, many of those beautiful shiny objects. How do you make sure that you stay aligned and you're all pulling in the same direction, so that you can execute effectively?
Sure.
It's not just efficiency. I'm an industrial engineer, so efficiency is a lovely word to me, but sometimes we get too caught up in the just driving towards the goal that we set, rather than understanding that the world changes pretty rapidly today, and we do need to be flexible and adaptable both in the goals that we set and in how we measure our progress towards them.
Sure. So how did you guys get to Florida then?
Oh, yeah. So this is a very roundabout story. I actually, when Bob came and lived with me in California, which was lovely.
Okay.
And remember, I grew up in the desert.
Sure.
This is a key factor. Bob had been living in Vermont.
Okay.
And so he took me to Vermont in October to see if thought I could live there. Because I'm like, hey, I'm a big city girl. I don't know if I could do Vermont or not. But October in Vermont,
Okay.
It's fall leaf change.
Sure.
It's, one of those beautiful places in the world. There's a giant Lake Champlain. There were geese. We saw a moose. And best of all, they have a wonderful little airport that's 40 minutes from New York City.
Okay.
And so I said, well, yes, of course I could live here, because, who would want to live in this beautiful place with all this water, who grew up in the desert with no trees and no water? And so we lived there for 20 years. And basically, I fly to work for most of my clients.
Sure.
And then once Bob decided on the Tai Chi and fishing path,
Sure.
He was done with winter. And so Vermont didn't make much sense to live in. And I just need to be near a good airport.
Okay.
So we moved to South Florida, to Jupiter, Florida. And I'm near an excellent airport. And he gets up every morning, and the first thing he sees after he looks over me is the boat.
Nice.
So we both got our dreams met.
That does not sound terrible at all. The only thing that I don't understand about Florida is how you guys do anything in the summer, because literally crossing the street, you're like dripping wet.
Yeah, we don't. One thing I knew from living in Houston so long was I didn't want to be here in the summer. So we kept our house in Vermont for many years. Gotcha. And then last year we sold it, and it was we did a 90-day road trip.
Nice.
And I just use different airports to fly to work. And basically, as long as I have my laptop,
sure,
and I have an airport, I'm in pretty good shape.
No, very cool. So I want to dive a bit deeper into what are you doing today? Because you wrote a book. What's the book called, and what made you decide to actually write the book? Yeah,
so the book is called No Dumbing Down.
Okay.
Which is one of the strategies in the book, but it's basically a primer. It's a no nonsense guide for CEOs on organizational growth. So it's that sort of once things get going, right? Once you've got that product market fit, because without that, the rest of it doesn't matter so much. Then what do you do to really get the internal strategies to support that external growth?
Okay.
And I sort of hadn't desired writing a book.
Okay.
But then the process of writing it, someone talked me into it would be a good idea. The process of writing it, which really helped me codify my ideas and sort of, oh yeah, I am doing these things with these same things with many companies and getting these results. And so it helped me both sort of think through what I was doing, but also gave me a way to reach more people with the work that I was doing.
Very cool.
And so that's really how the book came about. And fortunately, I found a publisher right off the bat, and so it came out last October. And now I'm, it's both selling, but also I'm speaking on it and doing workshops on it and that sort of thing. So it's just an expansion of the work that I've been doing.
Sure. So how do you work with CEOs or other organizations to actually make changes with them? Because I think that in itself can be really tricky, right? Especially people they grow a company to a certain point and it's obviously been successful. Yep. It's got to be hard sometimes for them to hire somebody like you, because you basically are trying to work with them to take them to the next level. And sometimes that can require a lot of changes. Sometimes it doesn't, or maybe they need to adapt, or all the things. So how do you work with them to kind of take them to the next kind of level? Or um, next
Mhm.
kind of 10, 5, 3 years in their company?
Yeah. And those are the questions, right? Is, hey, we're here. We've got this explosive growth going on around
Sure.
us. How do we navigate through that so that we can come out to whatever the end point, which is typically an exit of some sort. We want what do we want that to be, and how do we get there?
Sure.
So it's got to be a trusting relationship.
Sure.
So people have to trust that I can help them do that. But maybe even more important, they have to want to do things differently. It's that old, what got you here won't keep you here or
Sure.
won't get you there. And I don't know whether, that's been attributed to several different people, but it's completely true, right? All those amazing skills that the typical founder slash CEO has were wonderful right up until the point that they're not.
Yeah, fair.
And so, right? And so as you navigate this explosive growth in your organization, sort of coaching the CEO and the senior team, because I think both are really important, to understand sort of what their strengths are, so we can continue to build on those, and what the new needs are that aren't getting met, and either how do we develop those within the organization, or how do we hire them
Sure.
so that these blind spots that oftentimes we have, because they're not areas we've worked in before, don't get in our way.
Yeah,
And
fair.
and so that takes sometimes that it looks like coaching. Oftentimes it looks like working with the leadership team around developing their skills, helping them stay accountable for the plans that they put out, or conscious about changes that they make. And you can do that in a whole variety of ways, but typically it's some cadence that we get on around maybe offsites once a quarter or something, where we really focus in on plans and goals and results from the last quarter, because I'm all about business outcomes.
Sure.
And then also, as the company is growing, how do you maintain that alignment between all those different functions? Because one of the things that can happen is that we hire amazing individual contributors, right?
Yeah.
People who are really good at jobs, and then we make them managers or leaders, and they may or may not have the skills to do that. But they could be over focused on sort of maximizing their function or their unit instead of optimizing for the whole.
Sure. Interesting.
Yeah, and what I don't mean, this is where sort of no dumbing down comes from. I don't mean that anyone or any function should have to dumb down to the level of sort of the lowest performing member on their team, which is what often happens.
Okay.
But how do we get all the parts of the team, all the parts of the organization working at a place where they're contributing everything they can, but it's done in a way that is optimized with all the other parts? Because those cross-functional results, cross-functional relationships are so important to success for a growing organization.
Sure. And you can tell me if this is a bit of a tangent, or maybe if it's even off topic, but I'm really curious to get your thoughts, because you've been in the trenches doing this. Is like, take myself for example. I mentioned to you a while ago that I've kind of been a designer most of my career, and I think at my last job before we sold, I basically got promoted is the wrong term for it, but let's just go with that. To where I was doing way less design and kind of managing the people that were actually doing the design. And the running joke, at least I've heard, is kind of like, you get promoted so far away from what you're truly passionate and qualified to do that you become almost miserable and terrible at your job, because you don't even know what you're doing anymore, because that's not your passion or what you're trained for. Right. So how do you work with people? Because obviously as you get older, younger people with the new skill sets come in and do that and need to do that. How do you work with people that, were maybe employee 10 or 100, and now the company's thousands of people, and they're promoted to managing people below them, but they're kind of struggling because maybe they were trained, maybe they weren't trained, maybe they hate it, maybe they love it, but don't really know what to do to help the people that they're managing? Because that to me seems like a huge issue that I even struggled with, right? It's like, how do you manage people when you were like, I don't really want to be a manager, but now I'm a manager.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's so common. And there are a number of ways to approach that. One is just to recognize the fact that a growing organization needs a constant supply of leaders.
Okay.
And those leaders can be managing people, but you can also lead from an influencing position. But to recognize we don't just need to have our executive team, but as the organization grows, that current leadership team is going to have to take on more and more responsibility. And so we're going to have to offload some of that.
Sure.
That happens naturally. The question is, do you have someone to offload it to that is capable of picking it up and doing it well? And so one of the things I'll do with organizations that are sort of growing this quickly is to develop that next layer of leadership.
Okay.
So that's there. But when we take the case of what you were saying, so someone who comes in and they're really good at a function,
Sure.
and they get promoted, which this happens all the time. Somebody's really good at doing, and we say, okay, you're good at doing, therefore you can manage the doing.
Sure, because it's almost
And
like
they're
you're dumbing it down for
completely
me,
different
right?
skills.
Like,
Right,
if I'm
exactly.
the worst
It's individual dumbing
possible
down.
manager, you're kind of
Right.
dumbing it down for me, right?
Yeah, because we
Yeah.
don't come out of the womb knowing how to do this,
Sure.
most of us. So you need to give the person going into that role some support, for one, so that they can learn more about what it means. I mean, a lot of managers, even at the first, second, third level of management, are not comfortable giving feedback.
Interesting.
They're not comfortable dealing with conflict.
Sure.
Right? They're not comfortable with setting performance goals. That's why so many people don't get their performance reviews. Well, performance reviews should be given all the time, so that when the annual review comes around, it's just a matter of recapping what was said during the year. But so many people put it off, so that it's this big thing, this monster that rears its head, at the beginning of the year.
Interesting.
And it doesn't have to be that way. But anyway, I think for like people who've been promoted up and are unhappy, you have to sort of step back and think, what is it that does motivate me? And so people are typically either motivated by power or affiliation or achievement. This was a model by a guy
Like
named
one of
McClellan.
those three things or all those
One
things?
of those, all three, but in different proportion.
Okay.
So like I'm highly achievement motivated. I have a middle low affiliation and like almost no power motivation.
Okay.
So
interesting.
Right. So for me,
But how did you
as
figure that out? Sorry to go off on a
Oh,
tangent
no.
again.
I took an assessment.
Okay.
I had some really smart person around me who said, "Oh, you'd be interested in knowing this. It would help you." And so
Okay.
I got that information. I learned more about myself, and I decreased my blind spots, which made me more effective. And by learning that, I realized that because I'm so achievement motivated, what I could get more achievement, I could get more done by working through others.
Okay.
Right?
Interesting.
And so that became a motivator for me to be a better manager, a better leader.
Interesting. Okay.
Right? But if what you love is the doing of the thing,
Sure.
then what happens is we become a manager because we make more money.
Yeah.
I mean, nine times out of 10, and maybe even more than that,
Yeah.
somebody says, yes, I want the manager title because it comes with a raise
Yeah.
and stock, right?
Yeah.
Rather than having a technical track as well in an organization where people are rewarded for, greater and more technical ability. So they don't have to do that to make more money. Now, one of the fabulous things about tech is that with the availability of options, people can make money
Yeah.
without having to get brought over into the management and leadership side if they're not inclined to go that way.
Yeah, you're right. It is one of the few industries where you have that option, right? Because
Right.
yeah,
No pun intended.
yeah, no, fair enough. It's interesting, right? Because, I think too, and again, drawing from my own selfish experience, like as you get older and you start having a family, obviously making more money and having benefits for your kids, and my kids are still like 2 and 4, but you start thinking, like, what if they need braces one day? Well, employee benefits starts factoring into the decision, because you're like, well, if I have to fork out money for braces one day, or if my employer just covers that or part of that, it sounds kind of stupid when you're 20, because when I was 20, I was like, wow, I don't really care about any of that stuff, right?
Right. Yeah.
But like when you're in your mid-30s, and you have kids and you're married, you're like, oh, well, all that stuff becomes way more important, right? So
Right.
it's hard kind of navigating that sometime, right? Like, do I take more money and more responsibility
Mhm.
and do less what I love? Or do I just kind of go back to doing what I love and make less money? Or it's a struggle, right? And
It is, and there's no one right answer there. Right, different times of life, you're going to be
Sure.
motivated in different directions.
Sure.
What I hate seeing, what sort of breaks my heart, is seeing people who are in roles that they really don't like.
Sure.
And you can't be successful because the people that are working for you know that you don't like this role.
Yeah, interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it's really hard to be successful in a role like that. And so I think one of the ways to start to make that better for people is to help them see sort of what's in the role that you can like, that you can find some purpose in, that you are good at, that you do enjoy doing. What is it that really, other than the paycheck, that gets you up in the morning and wanting to flip on a computer or show up at the office?
Sure.
And if you can figure that out, and sometimes it's just, hey, I love doing this thing, but I love doing it so that the end customer gets value from it.
Sure.
Right? And so if you can flip that into, by managing people and doing it well, we can do an even better job of creating that value at the end of the chain.
No, that makes sense.
Right? And so sometimes that's enough. So it's the and as I said earlier, maybe it's not the doing of the thing, but the way that you do it that is satisfying to you.
Sure.
Right? So like for me, I'm a problem solver. I can't not solve a problem. And so I just need to make sure that I am focused on problems that need to be solved. And it really doesn't matter as much what it is that I'm doing. Now, I've chosen this area really of sort of, executive leadership
Sure.
and high performance teams and high growth, because I get a lot of juice there, but I can do that for a nonprofit,
Sure.
right? Who's not growing at light speed or who has sort of issues that are different. But I can do that because it's still a problem to be solved and I have the skills to do it. And it's rewarding for me to solve the problem.
Sure. So, I want to go back to the book though, because how do you work with kind of CEOs and their leadership team to actually guide them through the changes and growth and actually staying kind of relevant in the ever-changing landscape?
Yeah. And let's just start by saying not everyone stays relevant, right? Not everyone
Okay.
chooses to grow with a company, right?
Interesting.
People will opt out and say, hey, this has been amazing, but I really like sort of this early stage.
Sure.
So they go find another early stage to be part of.
Okay.
And then someone who enjoys sort of this later stage will come in. I think about sales, for example. The sales leader in an organization will often change as the organization grows.
Sure.
Just because it's a different skill set. Maybe you're moving from sort of selling to one class of customer to another. Maybe small, medium business up to enterprise at some point,
Sure.
right? It's a different skill set that you may or may not be drawn to or have when the company needs it, because you always want to ask, do we have time to develop this in the person that we have, or do we have to hire it from outside because we don't have time for the development? So that's the whole thing, is whether the team that's there wants to grow with the company or not. Some will, some won't. But working with these senior leaders, I talk about several different strategies in the book that will support them in making sure they have the right internal strategies to support this external growth. So one of those is this idea of no dumbing down, right? So how do you get your organization to work at full potential without dumbing down your output? And one of the things that occurred at Compaq was we had an amazing founder and CEO who was so good at making sure that happened because he was vigilant
Right.
for people who were dumbing down the conditions that cause it. So that starts at the top.
Interesting.
Then secondly, helping the team look at their processes, their tools, and their behaviors because sometimes those get stuck.
Okay.
Right? We're doing it this way because we've always done it this way. Well, fine, but it doesn't work that way anymore, right?
Yep.
And so to think about a continuum sort of from startup to grown up, but to know that that's not a one-way street.
Yeah. Okay.
You can get stuck on one end or the other. And what you really want is to be agile enough to pick the right response to the situation you're in, because things change.
Sure.
And so I've seen young companies who were so overburdened with process that they couldn't get out of their own way. Right. And I've seen old companies that never put enough process in place to be able to take advantage of all the benefits of process, right? All the replicability and the scalability of process. And so these companies would just keep, sort of reinventing the wheel every time,
Sure.
which takes a lot of time and attention away from the leadership team, who should be focused on other things at that point. So really looking at processes, tools, and behaviors, and making sure that you're responsive to the changes that are happening. And then I have this idea. It's called playing bumper cars.
Okay.
So this is thinking about what happens when unexpected events occur.
Sure.
Now we know they're going to,
Yep.
right? No one is 100% at planning and strategy and prognosticating. And so to make sure that we create sort of guardrails for ourselves and our plans, because we will not grow in a straight line.
Right.
We're either going to grow faster than we think, or we're going to grow not as fast as we thought we would.
Yeah.
And so to have the plans in place for those sort of, what are the boundaries of that growth, either up or down? What's the markers so we know when we hit them, and then what will we do in response? And it's sort of like bumper cars, because as you know, if you're playing bumper cars, you get hit by another car. It can send you careening off in a direction you weren't expecting. But those guardrails bring you back in.
Yeah, interesting.
And so, right? So think about what are those for the organization. And then I think it's also really important for senior teams in particular, but this is true for everyone in the organization, to make sure that they are spending enough time looking at the long view.
Okay.
And the big picture. And so that requires taking time to think.
Okay.
Because we get so caught up in the short term and the urgent,
Yeah.
that we don't take enough time to think and to look at sort of the big picture.
Okay.
And no one is ever going to put that on your calendar. It's
Sure.
like figuring out what your career is going to be, right?
Yeah.
No one ever puts time on your calendar for you to do that.
Sure.
Same thing with the organization, and having a once a year strategy retreat is just not often enough in today's world.
Sure.
And so I like to think about the executives I work with sort of levitating in a way, right?
Okay.
They're just getting above it all.
Yeah.
And looking at the big picture. For some people, they can do that an hour a week, and that's fine. For other people, it takes them an hour to get all the crap out of their head so they can begin to do that.
Interesting.
So they need larger blocks of time. But the important thing is put time on your calendar to look at the big picture so that you can think bigger.
Okay.
And not get just sort of drawn back into sort of what's the urgent. I mean, so many people just go from meeting to meeting playing whack-a-mole all day, right?
Sure.
Just sort of hitting problem after problem after problem on the head, and then another problem pops up. And that's not going to stop. You cannot win that game.
Sure.
Until time runs out, right? That's how the game is won. It's not that the moles ever stop popping up.
Yeah, interesting.
And so making sure that you are spending your time on the most important things, sort of highest and best use of your time.
Sure.
And for people, particularly in leadership positions, one of the things you're paid for is taking time to think and seeing the big picture. It's not just problem solving every day.
Interesting. Yeah.
And
that's actually really good advice.
Thank you. And then the very last thing, and I think I call this sort of the so what. We all have, we've read books or gone to conferences, and we have good ideas about things we could do, and we have intentions maybe about doing them, but how to get those behaviors and intentions aligned can be hard.
Sure.
Hard to change our behaviors. And so putting in place an accountability structure, both for you individually, but also with your team,
Sure.
so that you can hold each other mutually accountable to make sure that you get the things done that you say you're going to do without too much distraction.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because, and you could tell me your thoughts on this, is you go to a conference with a couple of your coworkers, and I don't know, let's say it's a Wednesday to Friday type thing.
Yeah.
You fly home on Saturday and you have Sunday to kind of decompress. You all obviously come back to work on the Monday, and you're pumped, you just came back from a conference, you want to try a bunch of new things. I find like a couple weeks later, you're back to kind of doing the same old kind of stuff you were doing before you went to that conference.
Mm-hmm.
So how
Yeah.
do you keep that going? Because in some ways, you could say that about a lot of things, right? You read this new book
Yeah,
or
that's
this
right.
and that. It's like, but how do you actually go about implementing the stuff that you learn at your company, whether you're the CEO or maybe way down in the totem pole? How does that kind of work?
Yeah, that's exactly what happens, right? I mean, I experience it myself, right? There's so many good ideas
Sure.
floating around in the world, and that's why you have to schedule time to
Okay.
think about, is this really important to me? Why is it important? So you have what's your internal motivation going to be for doing something different? What are the first steps that I'm going to take towards getting it done?
Okay.
How do I recognize whether I'm being successful or not in making this change? How do I get support from other people in making the change? And then how do when you start seeing the results, but it's taking those first steps and actually doing something different, and that only comes from making time to do things different, right?
Okay.
And I'm a big fan of debriefing.
Okay.
And there are many different acronyms for this. I use PEDAL: plan, execute, debrief, and learn.
Okay.
So we say we're going to do something, we go do something, and then what happened?
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
And if you don't sit back at least once a week and say, here's what I thought I was going to get done this week.
Yep.
Not that I was going to go to every meeting on my calendar, but what's the output? What's the outcome of what I was doing this week? And then what did I learn from what happened?
Sure.
Right? Maybe I got distracted towards the end of the week, and I did other things that weren't part of the big picture that I was driving towards. But you have to take time to really think about, are my actions aligned with my intentions?
Sure. But how do you actually get people to do that? Because I think as people get busier.
Give me an example of something that you want to do differently that you're not doing now.
Well,
that would fall under what we're talking about.
Well, I think in a lot of cases, some of that stuff, I guess a simple example would be like even finding time to like meditate every day, right? And think about some of the stuff, or just relax. I know sometimes it only takes 10 or 15, maybe even a half hour, or working out or something like that. Like just to kind of decompress and think about that stuff. That stuff, at least in my experience, is so easy to let slide because you have other things that are more pressing. And I put that in kind of air quotes, right? It's really hard to do air quotes on
it's
audio.
that urgent versus important conversation. I have a great story. I have a friend whose name is Mark.
Okay.
And Mark is a positioning consultant, and he's amazing.
Okay.
And he's highly in demand.
Okay.
Mark is as busy as he wants to be, and he spends most of his days on phone calls or Skype and working with clients. And he stops every day at 4:30.
Okay.
And I'm like, well, Mark, why 4:30? And he said, well, I stop at 4:30 because I go to the gym every day at 4:30.
Okay.
I said, okay, there's more to this story. Tell me more. And he said, well, I do that because I stopped going to the gym at 4:30 once, and I didn't, and the results were horrible. And what happened was, Mark was going to the gym every day at 4:30. He was in great shape. He felt good. His energy level was high, and he had clients and his clients, by the way, I mean, these are people who are calling him with big, important problems.
Sure.
Right. And so he had clients who would call late in the day and say, hey, I'd really like to talk with you at 5.
Okay.
Or could we just talk today from 4:30 to 5? Or could I talk to you from 5:30 to 6 or something?
Sure.
And so he started making exceptions. And one day turned into 2 days, turned into 3 days, turned into a lot of days.
Sure.
And what he noticed was he gained weight.
Sure.
He didn't feel quite as sharp as he had before, and that it wasn't good for him.
Okay.
Right? And he still wasn't solving all the problems. Right? People were still calling and saying they had problems, and he just didn't have enough time to do all of it.
I got you.
And so he said, enough.
Yeah. Okay.
My rule is at 4:30 I go to the gym.
You need to learn your
he
limitations,
goes,
right?
It's discipline. Yeah. And so he goes to the gym every day at 4:30, and his weight dropped back to what it had been before. He started feeling better, and he knew that he was sort of serving the clients that he had at the best of his ability. And so it's not about, it's the old saw about it's not how much you do, it's about doing what you do well.
Sure.
And that doesn't mean everything has to be 100%, right? Some things are good at 80%. I'm not arguing for that.
Sure.
But you can't solve all the world's problems. Any organization will take as much time from you as you will give it. I have never run across someone who said, "Okay, my job here is done." Right?
Yeah, fair enough, right?
I'm finished for the day, and not in the sorts of jobs that we have or that your listeners have. It's not like ever at 4:30 you say, "Oh, okay, I'm out of things to do. I could just stop now." Right? It has to be something that internally is better for you and better for the work that you're doing. And it's the same thing. I'm a long-time Zen Buddhist. It's the same thing with meditation. I know that I am better when I meditate.
Sure.
Not just me personally, but my work is also better. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I think I've kind of really realized that more and more, and how important that is as I get older and into kind of my mid-30s now, that figuring out your own limitations, right? And where you need to just kind of throw up the white flag and say, I'm done for now or today or whatever that means. And I need to focus on something else. And to your friend's example, it's like he needs to go to the gym every day because that's his thing, right?
Yeah.
And just being able to figure that out and actually stick to that as much as possible in the week. Because I'm sure there's days that he can't do it for whatever reason. But if you get offset because of travel or something and you can't do that, or you're at a conference or whatever, but getting back to whatever works for you as quick as possible if you get thrown off, and getting back into that routine becomes super, super important. And figuring that out, whatever works for you, seems to be the best advice or things that I've kind of seen that have worked for majority of people. Because the thing that bugs me the most, and you can tell me your thoughts on this, is the 10 things successful people do every morning, but before 6 a.m. And it's like, well, you know what? If you're not a morning person and I'm not a morning person, I will never wake up earlier to get stuff done because I am not that person. It seems stupid to me. If you have a list that says 10 things to do as a night person or a night owl, I'll check out that list and maybe try one or two of those things and see if they work for me. But all those lists that say if you should get up at 5 a.m. or 4 a.m. to do these things, that it will never work for me because I'm not that type of person. And
the most important thing for you to do before 6:30 in the morning is sleep. And that's completely fine, right? You don't have to do what everybody else does. Yeah.
So it's interesting. So we're kind of coming to the end, but I really want to get your thoughts. Is there anything else that you've learned over your career that you want to either demystify or wish more people did?
Yeah. Well, I would say some of the best advice I ever got, I'll give you a couple of things.
Sure.
One is, I got this pretty early in my career, and I only wish I had gotten it much younger. And that is to ask for what you want and notice what you get. I think too often we fail to ask people for what we want from them.
Sure.
We just make up stories about why they're not doing it.
Yeah.
But if you'll ask for it and ask for it directly, your chances of getting what you want are vastly increased.
Well, sometimes it actually happens.
Do it. That's right. It might happen. In fact, chances are much better that it will happen once you ask for it, right?
Yeah.
And then notice what you get, right? If you don't get it, then you've got to figure out some other way to influence or move on. But ask for what you want, notice what you get. I think that's something that's a behavior that's really good. And oftentimes we don't do it because we are conflict avoidant.
Or scared.
And, right, or scared, which is a reason to avoid conflict. Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
So think about that. I'd say the number one thing that I tell my clients is just to make sure they're thinking big enough and they're planning big enough. Doesn't mean you have to execute on all those plans, but to make sure that you've planned in a way that you're able to take advantage of the opportunity in front of you.
Yeah, that's actually really good advice, because I think the best example, and you can tell me if you've heard a better one of that, is I've heard the running joke, at least with a few people I kind of in my immediate friend group that work at kind of a startup or a company. It's like, we're going to sell coffee to every business in a downtown city that we live in. And that's going to be $1 billion idea. It's like, no, your idea needs to be, we're going to sell coffee to every business in every downtown in every city on the planet, where people seem to think about their own geographic region. And sometimes that makes sense. Other times it doesn't. But I find a lot of people don't think like, no, your goal needs to be global, not in your own little city in most cases. Do you agree with that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, whatever bigger is for the business that you're in, right? And just explore, think bigger. You may decide, hey, I could sell to everybody on the planet, but I kind of like just living here and doing what I'm doing, and that's fine, right? But make sure you're clear about what all your options are before you settle on a course. I think too often, particularly in the U.S. culture, we're so we get rewarded for making decisions quickly, and sometimes we bypass important options because we don't take in enough information before we make decisions. And so that's definitely something that I would recommend. And then, for me, the most important thing is making sure that you're working with a team in your organization, particularly the executive team, because if it doesn't happen there, it doesn't happen anywhere, that is aligned and that they are all moving and pulling in the same direction together. Because without that, you're just creating a gap in what's possible for you for growth that's self-inflicted. And you don't need to get in your own way. There's enough of other stuff out there that will try to derail you. So, you can do the things that are in your control are what happens internally in your company. And so really optimizing that output, I think is always something to consider.
Perfect. Well, Karen, we're coming to the end of the show. So let's close with mentioning where people can get more information about yourself, the book, and any other links you want to mention.
Yes, so my website is just Karen Walker, all traditional spelling, KarenWalker.us. And on all the social media sites, I am Karen Walker US.
Okay.
And then the book you can either find on my site, or if you just type in nodumbingdown.com, that will take you to a place where you can buy it.
Perfect. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time of your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. I so appreciated having a conversation as part of the podcast. So appreciate your style. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Bye.
Thanks for listening. Please visit our website at buildingthefutureshow.com to join the free community, sign up for our newsletter, or to sponsor the show. The music is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.